We all must search. We must search for what is truth.
What is truth?
Truth is
just that's a really hard question. What is truth?
There has to be a fixed truth, in my opinion, for the universe to function properly.
What is truth?
And the lonely voice of youth cries, what is truth?
And the truth shall set you free!
On the show today, we've got Gary Habermas. Gary, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Dr. Gary Habermas is the author and co-author of over 30 books and 100 articles and reviews in journals and magazines. In the last 16 years, he has given over 1,500 lectures in about 100 universities, seminaries, and colleges. He holds a Ph.D. in History and Philosophy of Religion from Michigan State University, as well as an M.A. in Philosophical Theology from the University of Detroit. He currently acts as a Distinguished Research Professor and Chair in the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University, where he has taught for the past 30 years. His main areas of research include the philosophical study of miracles, near-death experiences, the historical Jesus, and the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Gary, I didn't know about the near-death experiences one. We're going to have you back on the show to talk about that. That's something that has intrigued me for years. How are you today, Gary?
Doing well, thank you.
Very good. Gary, we hear a lot about the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus from Christians and in the debate field, and a lot of what they'll use this for is to explain why a bunch of weak-willed apostles and the disciples went on to a martyr's death. And they're saying that they're using the martyr's death as an example of how we can know that it happened. How did they go from weak-willed men to fearless men who gave their lives for this? First of all, how is the martyr's death a validation for the truth of the resurrection when we don't validate any truth of Islam when Muslims, fanatics, give themselves as martyrs all the time? So how is that different, Gary?
Well, that's a good question. It goes like this. Christians ought not use the martyrdom or the willing martyrdom of the disciples as proof that Christianity is true. Rather, the way it should be used, in my opinion, is that it is evidence that the early disciples thought that what they were proclaiming was true. Let's put it this way. Whenever someone dies for something, now it could be a non-Christian, it could be somebody dying for communism, it could be a Buddhist priest setting themselves on fire to protest the war in Vietnam, the Muslim examples you talked about, Christian missionaries. I think we'd be willing to concede that every willing martyrdom where a person willingly gives himself up is evidence that that person thinks that what they're teaching is true.
Uh-huh.
Here's the difference. People who are martyred today, in the cases I just gave, they died for what they thought to be truthful. Of course, they could be wrong. The thing with the disciples that's so significant is that the resurrection was the center of the Christian message. As the center of the Christian message, if you have the resurrection of Jesus, you have Christianity. If you don't have the resurrection of Jesus, there's no Christianity.
Yes.
The disciples are in the best position to know whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead, i.e., was he dead and was he seen later? And they died for the belief that they had seen him alive. That is their stamp of approval, let's say, on the most important part of Christianity. So let's just say they were so sure that Jesus had been raised from the dead that they were utterly willing to die for that proclamation. That's why it's valuable, because they're the only ones who are in the right place at the right time to confirm a resurrection. Today, Christians die because of what the disciples believed, but the disciples died for thinking that they saw the risen Jesus, and that's why that is an evidence.
So basically what you're saying is first-hand knowledge versus second, third, or fourth generation knowledge. They had first-hand knowledge of whether or not that was true or not. Where that's the giant gap between anybody who gives their life now versus the disciples who gave their lives. They saw firsthand.
Correct.
Whether or not. I mean, if they were fabricating the lie, is what I'm hearing you saying, they would have never
Right.
gone to their deathbed for that. if they were just trying to exalt him to some status, and somebody really, it reminds me of the time that Hitler was really pushed into the corner, and all of Hitler's men said, we'll fight to death, and then when the Reds closed in on him and the Yanks came in from the south, all of a sudden they threw down their guns, threw up their hands, and said, wait a second, we were just kidding about that death thing. It was not a matter of dying to the death, whereas the apostles died to the death. That's a pretty strong evidence.
Right. Now, there's two major things. Not only are they your point about first generation versus later generations, but somebody could say, well, we have our first generation martyrs too. Well, that's true, they do. But then the second point of it is, but what are your martyrs, what are your first generation martyrs dying for? And they could say, well, they heard the master speak, whoever that is in that particular religion, and you could say they heard the master speak, and they were convinced he was right. Okay, fine, we'll give you that. If they willingly died as martyrs, they thought the master was right. But only in Christianity is there a resurrection. Jesus is the only founder of a major world religion whose followers believed he was raised from the dead. So you not only have first-generation folks who are dying for their faith, but in the disciples' case, they're dying for an event. We're not asking them, do you think your religion is true or not? Of course, everybody does think their religion is true. We're asking the disciples, are you willing to die because you thought you saw the risen Jesus? Because that's the center of Christianity. And they said yes. So they died for an event, and they died for a unique event that's not true of any other religion. So starting to put that together is why we have such a good case here.
How do we even know that the apostles and disciples went on to the martyr's death anyways? Are there historical references, maybe extra biblical or secular sources that cite that?
Well, yes. To me, I think Christians, again, this is another area where Christians need to be careful. They ought not have claimed in the first case that someone dying for your faith proves the faith is true.
Yeah.
That we don't want to make that move. Okay, this one here, there's a kind of a caveat too. I tell my students, if we're going to make the claim that Christians often do, that all the early disciples died for their faith except John, and they tried to kill him. Christians frequently make that comment. Well, if you want to assert that, there's several things wrong. First of all, we have a second century source that John was martyred. So that's a pretty early source. But in order to get that kind of all the disciples, all the apostles died for their faith, you have to use some questionable and some late sources. I'll be honest about that. Okay, so 2 points. I like to make the point with my students. I tell them, don't argue that everybody died for their faith. Argue that everybody was willing to die for their faith. And that's really what you need for this argument. You need people who are so sure they were willing to die, and that belief is conceded by everybody. You go, well, okay, but what do we actually have on dying for their faith? Well, what's significant there, secondly, is that the four biggest names connected with Christianity, Paul, Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus, the four of them are the most influential in the early church. Uh-huh. We have sources outside the New Testament for the martyrdom of three of those four. And then, like I said, we have a second century source, which is still pretty early, a second century source for John's martyrdom. So we do have good evidence that the big four, so to speak, died. And they're the same four. They're the same three that Paul met together with in Galatians 1 and 2 and ascertained that they were all preaching the same thing about the nature of the gospel. So that's very significant. We do have documentation of their martyrdoms.
What would you say to somebody? You've said a few times that he's the only risen Savior, and I know this could be 3 shows all by its lonesome. Could you maybe just touch on that as far as I know that there's alleged allegations that Christianity borrowed from ancient pagan religions. Is there can you speak to that and maybe diffuse that quickly?
About the copying off other religions?
Yeah, I mean, if he really is the only one who's ever risen, that's a big claim compared to. There's a lot of people I've run into in my path that have said, well, Jesus isn't the only risen Savior. You've got Mithra. You've got you can go down an entire line of alleged pagan religions where you've had dying and rising gods.
Right.
And I know, Gary, that could turn into another show, but I was wondering if you could just kind of. Is there a quick diffusal for that? Yeah, I'll try to speak to it real quickly. First of all, I'm real careful when I use certain words. What I said was Jesus is the only founder. Jesus is the only founder of a major world religion. Those guys,
none of them founded world religions. None of them are big names. In fact, nobody thinks any of them lived in history. So it's a totally different category. Okay, now back to the claim, did they rise from the dead? We don't have any pre-Christian literature that any of those mythical persons. Now you say, well, somebody might say, well, I think Jesus is mythical too. But I mean, we're talking about people like Hercules and, people like that. There's no reports that any of them were raised from the dead prior to Christianity. The earliest one we have is for Adonis, and Adonis is 2nd century A.D. Jesus is 1st century A.D. The second earliest we have is Attis. Attis is 3rd century A.D. So as several people have argued, Bruce Metzger, Craig Blomberg, as several people have argued, they could actually have been saying, oh yes, our God rose from the dead too, after Christianity started preaching it. Because we do know that they claimed other things to sort of like extend the Christian claims to their gods. Yeah. But my point is, they're not pre-Christian. So if anybody says, well, we got these pre-Christian cases, we don't. These stories were spread around before Jesus, but as far as we know, there's no resurrection accounts in them before Jesus' resurrection. So, I mean, there's many problems. That's just one of the issues that they're too late. The stories are too late. The main thing is that the disciples' teaching is not based on, I know other people believe this, but we believe it too. The disciples is based on the fact their claim was, we saw him. Now, that doesn't mean they were right, but the fact is we saw him, not somebody else has this belief, and so now we're borrowing it for Jesus. They're saying we saw him. So you have to deal with their language of sight. They're claiming to have seen Jesus after his death. That's probably the main problem with those other views, is that nobody was copying, that they were given evidence for this appearance or appearances that they witnessed.
It sounds to me like it's a funny way to say it is Christianity has the patent on the dying and rising God. Where everybody else is waited for the patent to run out and then went and invented their own story. It's so funny because if you go onto the websites, you'll see up and down the block where there's ancient traditions that predate Christianity, and that's what I've run into every time, because I'm a real big fan of getting back to the root of it. And when we get back to the root of it, if anybody stole from anybody, it's the other tradition stole from the Christian story, not the other way around. And that it's a funny thing that it's so widespread in the atheist circle.
Well, I'll tell you this, Dave. You say it's all over the blogs. It's on a high percentage of non-Christian blogs. But here's the catch-22. The blogs that report that are generally these blogs that kind of react, this knee-jerk kind of criticism of Christianity, blogs that are run by guys who don't specialize in the area. They just kind of go off on Christians. Anybody can say anything on blogs today. Yeah. If you go to scholars, skeptics, atheists, unbelieving scholars who are specialists in the historical Jesus, they will almost never give this reason. So there's a real disconnect between these popular atheists who just say, they all copied, and scholars who know better. And the scholars, they can be as skeptical as you want. They can be atheists, they can be agnostics, but they almost never use this reason. Now, you have to ask, why don't the real skeptical scholars use this reason? Because they know the problems with it. Yeah.
Well, it's the same thing with you'd mentioned earlier, some people think that even Jesus was a myth, and I have to get a good chuckle out of that one, because it shows me that they really there's so much historical evidence for the actual man Jesus of Nazareth. Actually, that was kind of what made me transfer from atheist over to Christian, when I realized all the extra biblical evidence, and I realized that if they're making that argument, they really haven't put any time into research, because that one, as you said, at the scholarly or academic level, that's just not even brought up. That's a moot point that you would look stupid to bring that up in a debate. Is that correct?
At a scholarly level, sometimes they will say things like, "Oh, Christians weren't," they'll kind of talk around it, but no, they don't sit there and say Christians copied off other religions and invented the stories. No, they don't say that.
Yeah, that would hurt their case, absolutely. Well, Gary, thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've got family at the house, and so I appreciate you taking time to come on and talk with us. And I would like to have you back on for a few reasons, but as I said, the near-death experiences was one that I did not know that you tackled that subject. That is something that intrigues all of us, I think.
Yeah,
So,
it's a very interesting and a relevant topic for apologetics, too.
absolutely. Gary, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.